Bible history. And yet so often, this is a section of Bible history that I think we don't know very well. I know I've been in several Bible history classes or kind of an overview of the Bible, and what happens is this period kind of a little bit gets shortchanged. And so because of that, I think maybe we're not always as familiar with this part of the Bible as we should be. But it really is a fascinating and encouraging and amazing part of the Scriptures to study. And so hopefully as we go throughout this quarter, we'll see that. I want to start with a quote. And I think all of us, or at least most of us, can finish this quote if we see it. You can't really know where you are going until you know where you have been. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's a Maya Angelou quote. But there's a reason why I put that on the screen as we begin this morning. You can't really know where you're going until you know where you've been. Because if we consider Old Testament history, and let's say this line represents a timeline of Old Testament history, well then where would the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah, where would those fall? Well, at the end, right? And so as we're going into Ezra and Nehemiah, it's important to understand there's so much that has come before. And in order to really appreciate Ezra and Nehemiah, you have to know what happened earlier. As we read about the Jews and what's going on with them in these writings, we have to understand this is something that's occurring after a long period of Israelite history that's so significant. And what we need to understand is the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah, they assume that we already know the history. They assume we're already familiar with the earlier writings and that we know what occurred beforehand. And so because of that, you're going to have allusions to stuff that happened previously. You're going to have some things that occur that parallel events that happened before. Or sometimes you're just going to have a direct reference, a direct statement about something that occurred earlier. So for example, one of the ways that we can appreciate Ezra and Nehemiah so much more is if we are familiar with the Exodus. Or if we're really familiar with when the priesthood was established. Or if we have a good knowledge of what Moses said at the end of his life when he gave warnings to the people of Israel before Moses passed away. Or when Canaan was settled. That's very important to know and understand in order to appreciate what's happening in Ezra and Nehemiah. Same thing with God's covenant he made with David and David's family. Also, when the temple was built by Solomon. That's going to be something very significant for when we start getting into Ezra and Nehemiah. Also, the period of the kings, and for a lot of reasons, but especially because of how corrupt so many of the kings were. And the effects that caused, and how that changed what God wanted to happen. And then also the prophets, what the prophets said, the warnings they gave, the predictions they made. So much of that is going to help us as we get into Ezra and Nehemiah. And then also Jerusalem's destruction and the exile to Babylon. If we have a good knowledge of these things and others, that really aids us then as we go into Ezra and Nehemiah. And so throughout this quarter, we're going to be reflecting back on what happened earlier, highlighting a lot of these things, so that then it really helps us to appreciate what we're studying in Ezra and Nehemiah. Something also important to keep in mind is that so much of what is occurring, God said would occur. We're not reading something and thinking, well, it's weird how it worked out this way. No, in a lot of ways, this is what God said. It's going to happen like this. And so we'll look at some of that even this morning as we go through. Let's say something about biblical history in general. There's a few points that are important to make as we start going through some of these books. There's really two components. If you're gonna break down the study of biblical history, you could break it down into two really important components: events and facts, and then lessons and application. Both of those are extremely important in the study of biblical history. Now, what can happen is that sometimes we lean so far to one side, and it's at the expense of the other. And I think all of us have seen this before. And so, for example, let's say we're actually leaning a little too much into events and facts and ignoring the lessons and application. Well, what happens when that occurs? Well, I think we've all seen this. If you're teaching, and I'm sure I've done this before, but if you're teaching, you're giving the people in the class facts and dates and events and places, and then the bell rings and class is over. And okay, I mean, they've gotten a lot of information, but why is it important to know? That's kind of called the so what factor. At least I've heard it called that before, where your class gets all this information, they get these facts, they get these events, they get these names, they get these places, and they're sitting there and thinking, all right, I've got that, so what? Right? What's the practical application of that? What's the theological significance of that? What does that teach me about God? What does that teach me about my relationship with God? What am I supposed to use this for? And I think sometimes that's a problem that arises when we lean so much into the events and facts and then ignore the lessons and application. But then you can have the other extreme, right, where you have somebody that says something like, well, I'm not really into the history. I just want something practical. You know, I just want something I can take and use, something I can apply to my life right now, that I can just hear it, take it, put it into practice. Well, you see the problem with that. The problem is, okay, so often, some of the most powerful lessons and application come from the events and facts. That you learn the events and facts, and only then do you see the lessons and application. And so often what happens is we're not always as patient. We're not always as willing to do that because, well, it takes more time to learn the events and facts. It takes more effort to commit some of this to memory so that then you see why it's so significant later on for your understanding of God and your relationship with Him. And we see this happen so often when, we get to a genealogy. We're like, skip, and we go to the next section. Which, I think it's probably safe to say this, all of us have done that, right? Well, that's just a list of names. I want something practical. Well, sometimes really analyzing why is this here will provide us amazing lesson and application if we understand why it's there. And so as we go throughout this quarter, we're going to try and make sure that we don't just ignore lessons and application and just focus on events, facts, information. But at the same time, we don't want to expect there to be just great lessons and great application, but ignore the events and facts. That's not how it works either. So we're going to attempt, at least this quarter, to make sure that we have both of these. Because I think when you have both of these, that is a beneficial, healthy study of biblical history. And really all of that to say, we need to keep in mind, biblical history is selective. Really all history is selective. All recorded history is selective. But biblical history is selective. And what I mean by that is God purposely chose certain things to have recorded, and he purposely chose not to have other things that are recorded. You know, sometimes you ask somebody, okay, we're reading through the story, why is this here? And the answer is, well, because that's what happened. Now, that's not good enough, because there's a lot of things that happened that God didn't choose to talk about. There's a lot of things that happened that God didn't have recorded in his scriptures. So we need a better answer to that. Why is this here? Why is this story told? And I think that's especially true when you see in the scriptures, you know, sometimes there's stories that are told in 3 different places in Scripture. The same story told in 3 different places. What's the reason for that? Or you'll see, okay, well, here's something being talked about, and there's a huge time gap, and then there's something else being talked about. Well, what happened in that time gap? You know, what occurred? God doesn't tell us. Okay, well then why does he tell us what happened before? And why does he tell us what happened afterward? If we can answer that question, that's going to be extremely beneficial for us as we're going through this biblical history. And so much of what we're going to do this quarter is focusing on that. Why is this said? Because he didn't have to tell us this. There's a lot he didn't tell us. Why did he tell us this? I think when we approach it that way, we'll start to really appreciate what's being talked about instead of, okay, well, here's what occurred and that's what happened and let's move on. No, there's a reason why it's there. And if we can figure out why it's there, that'll be very beneficial for us. All right, a couple things about Ezra and Nehemiah. As we're considering all that I just said, let's think about, okay, what happens in these writings? What are some events we're going to see in these writings? Well, we're going to see that the exile in Babylon, all those years spent in Babylonian captivity for the Israelites, that is finally over. It's done. And so because of that, the Jews are going to be allowed to return home to the Promised Land. They can go back to Canaan. They can go back to their land. We're also going to see that they reestablish their laws. So many of the laws that they didn't practice or that they forgot about, we're going to see that now they're reestablishing those. They're going to start putting those back into place. We're going to see that they rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, the temple that had been destroyed. They're going to rebuild it. And also they're going to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. Well, those are the events. I mean, those are the facts of what happened. But thinking about what I've just talked about, what's going to make this so beneficial is, what's the significance of the exile in Babylon? Not just, Babylonians, they ruled and then they conquered the Israelites and took them away. More than that, what's the theological significance of that? From God's point of view, what's so important about the exile in Babylon? What does that represent? That's going to be something that's going to be very important. Or what's the significance of the Promised Land? That land. Sure, in Ezra, they're going to start traveling back there. Okay, but what's so important theologically about that land and returning to that land? Or their laws. They hadn't been practicing their laws, and now they're starting to practice them again. Yeah, but what's the law represent? What's so significant about that? From God's point of view, what makes that so important? Or the temple in Jerusalem. What's the theological significance of the temple in the city of Jerusalem? What does that represent? Why is that significant? If you can answer that question, you're going to benefit a lot from reading these writings. Or the walls around Jerusalem. What do the walls around Jerusalem signify? What's the theological importance of those walls? If we can answer all those questions, these writings start to just come alive and we see, wow, this is why God recorded this for us. This is why it is so significant. This is why it holds great application for us. And so that's something we need to do not only in these writings, but also in any part of biblical history. Think about the significance of it, and I really think it helps us so much. A couple things to keep in mind about these writings. So, something maybe we're not always familiar with. You've probably heard me say a couple times now, the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah. Originally, these were considered one book. I know that in our Bibles, the way we've got them divided up, well, you have 39 books in the Old Testament, and that's true according to how we divide them now. But originally, Ezra and Nehemiah, they were considered one work. They're on the same scroll, and they were treated as one book. And it was like that for a long time. Once the Hebrew Scriptures got translated into Greek, they still considered that one book. It's not till way later that they got divided up and started being treated as two different books. And so the importance of that is we need to see this as a unified work. And so sometimes we miss something if, we're wanting to read something in the Scriptures, and I'll go read the book of Nehemiah. Like, okay, it's not like a problem really, but that is the second half of one work. And it was always considered that by the Jews as one work. So as we're going through Ezra and Nehemiah, just keep in mind that we may talk about Ezra chapter 2 and Nehemiah chapter 4, because that's the way to talk about where we are in the Scriptures. But really, it's all should be considered one book, one work. And so because of that, you'll see that events in one part, events that Nehemiah talks about, parallel things that Ezra already talked about. And there's a reason for that. This is considered was considered one work. So important to keep in mind, especially because your homework assignment is to start reading through this. We're really going to delve into Ezra chapter 1, hopefully next Sunday. Wednesday, we're going to look at some of the historical stuff that's occurred before. But a week from today, we're going to try and delve into Ezra chapter 1. So start reading through Ezra and then Nehemiah. You've got a good amount of material there to get through, but you've got a week. And most of us, I think, can listen to this as we drive in our cars. Most of us can sacrifice watching a TV show to spend time getting through this work. What I don't want to happen is we start going into it, and some people are like, I didn't read it, so I don't really know what happens. But Taylor will tell us, so I'll just wait and see what he says. No, it's actually really important for you to come already knowing what's in the books, or book, I should say, already knowing what's in there. Have that foundation, so then when we start talking about it, you're not learning it and then learning what happened and then also learning some of the lessons we bring up. You already know what's in there. You already know what happened, and now we're starting to see what's the significance of it. All right. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30. So I had said in that timeline I showed you of important things to know that are going to be beneficial and help us appreciate Ezra and Nehemiah, one of those are the warnings that Moses gave. The warnings that Moses gave at the end of his life. Well, Deuteronomy 30 is part of that. Deuteronomy chapter 30 is Moses giving them instruction and giving them warnings, giving them insight into the things that that they need to keep in mind. And so in previous chapters, Moses had gone over all the blessings that God has promised the Israelites if they obey him, and all the curses. And if you go back to a couple chapters before, you will see there is a long section of Scripture where Moses is describing, here are the things that will occur if you turn from the Lord. And I thought about us reading those in class, and I'm like, we don't have time. That would take 30 minutes to read all of those. But those have happened in Deuteronomy. Moses has gone over those with the Israelites. And now we get to chapter 30, and I want to start in verse 1. So Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you. And he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes and enemies who persecuted you. And you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all his commandments that I command you today. The Lord your God will make you abundantly prosperous in all the work of your hand, in the fruit of your womb, and in the fruit of your cattle, and in the fruit of your ground. The Lord will again take delight in prospering you, as he took delight in your fathers, when you obey the voice of the Lord your God, to keep his commandments and his statutes that are written in this book of the law, when you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So Moses is telling them, here are the curses if you don't obey the Lord. Then he goes further than that and says, once those have all happened, once those curses have happened, which kind of makes it seem like he knows this is going to happen, or at least the Lord through Moses indicating, I know this will happen because you are a stubborn people. Once those do happen, then Moses starts telling them, that's not the end. And records for us what we just read, which is just an amazing description of the grace of God. God's mercy, God's grace, that after huge levels of disobedience on Israel's part, unspeakable rebellion against God, after that, God would then bring them back. And so this passage is just an amazing depiction of this is who your God is, that he knows you're going to turn from me, but he also knows when you turn back, I'll bring you back, and I'll take away the curses, and I'll give you the blessings again. Well, here's why that's so important. When we start reading Ezra, we're reading that happen. It's the beginning of what Moses just talked about here. Because when Ezra starts, they're coming back. They're coming back from captivity, back to the promised land. And we're going to see as we read through Ezra and Nehemiah, they're going to start getting the stuff that Moses talked about here. They're going to start seeing Moses' words come to pass. That God's words through Moses are occurring in their time as they're journeying back to the promised land. And so these people are experiencing the grace of God, experiencing the love of God, the forgiveness of God, the mercy of God. And so you see why, knowing that Moses talked about this in Deuteronomy 30 is really going to make it significant then when you get to Ezra 1. And Ezra 1 records how Cyrus the Persian said, Jews can go home. Wow. Deuteronomy 30, coming true. Any thoughts on that so far? Any questions, any thoughts, anything about what I've said so far? All right. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. First Kings chapter 8 records Solomon's prayer that he gives after they finish building the temple of God. So they've spent years building that temple, and now they're going to offer this prayer to God and ask his blessing on this temple, this dwelling place where he would dwell among his people. So look at 1 Kings chapter 8. Let's see. I'm going to jump into the middle of Solomon's prayer. I don't mean to disrespect Solomon by doing that, but I'm going to go into verse 27. Verse 27. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea, O Lord my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day toward this house, the place which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer that your servant offers toward this place. All right, skip down to verse 46. Verse 46. Solomon has now started asking God of things in this prayer in reference to the temple. So in verse 46, speaking of the Israelites, he says, if they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and give them to an enemy, so that they are carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near, yet if they turn their heart in the land to which they have been carried captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned and have acted perversely and wickedly, if they repent with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven, your dwelling place, their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them, for they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt from the midst of the iron furnace. Let your eyes be open to the plea